One of the most important things about programming is managing your data. And in Java, you have to know specifically what type of data you're using. Java has these categories that it calls data types to help you understand specifically what kind of values can this data be. There's two categories of data types. Primitives, which are the most basic and simple types of data, things like simple numbers or letters or characters. And objects, which are things that Java has written or you're going to write, which sort of package a bunch of different things along with the data. For now, let's talk about primitives. As primitives are typically numbers, either with or without decimal places, you can do a lot of the same things you would do with these numbers as you would on a calculator. You can add, subtract, multiply. You can even use the modulus operator, which divides the two numbers and then returns back the resulting remainder. You can also increment and decrement your data if you use things like the plus plus, which means add 1, or you can say plus equals, which adds into that number however much you're indicating, like here. You can do the same thing with any of the arithmetic operators. Strings are a little bit different than the primitives, again, because they're an object. So for example, if I had you add together two strings, what would that result in? Well, in Java, it means you just sort of squish those strings together. This is called concatenation. And anytime you want to put two strings together, you need to have that plus sign between them. You can actually do a lot of pretty complex things with strings, and Java has done a lot of that work for you. Here are some of the different methods you can use to manipulate your strings. But really, you should go look up the API set, because I'm sure there's lots of different things you'll find ways to use. Now, because Java is so strict about its data types, it also has a very strict set of rules for what to do when two data types interact. Whenever an int and a double come up against each other, the result is always a double. Whenever a string comes up against anything else, the result is always a string. A string plus anything is a string. So because the computer moves from left to right, you've got to pay close attention, otherwise you can get some funny results. Other than from left to right, the computer basically follows PEMDAS. So it has an order of operations with multiplication, division, and modulus having the highest precedence and addition and subtraction having the lower precedence. You can also add parentheses to elevate something's precedence. There is a funny thing in Java about when you divide integers. That's because sometimes when you divide, you get decimal places. But one of the rules of being an integer is that you can't have them. So all Java does is when you divide one integer by another and there is some resulting decimal place, it just drops it. So for example, integer 10 divided by integer 3, instead of being 3.333, in Java, just 3. The reason you need to know these data types is because at some point you're probably going to want to store a piece of information and then manipulate it later on. This is where something called variables comes in handy. A variable is a named space in memory for a specific type of data. For example, you could have an int x that starts as 2 and eventually grows to 200. 2 and 200 are both ints, and they could both be stored under the name x at different points in your code. The way that you create a variable is with the type, then the name, then an equal sign, and whatever you want to store in there. For example, you could have string name equals Sam. Once you've made your variable, you use it by name. It's like you've made a new Java keyword. You have to make your variables higher up in your program's order than when you use it, meaning it has to exist before you try to use it. So if you make a variable on line 2, then you can start using it from line 3 onward. Variables also have this idea of scope. Wherever you make your variable, it's only going to live within the closest set of curly braces. And then as soon as the computer gets to that left curly brace, it's going to forget your variable. sometimes you're going to have different types of variables interacting, and you need them to get back to a certain type. You can force a piece of data to become a different variable type through something called casting. The way that you do that is you simply add the name of the type you want that piece of data to be in parentheses. When you're learning to work with variables and data types, it can get a little tricky. One of the most common errors is trying to store a piece of data as the wrong type. That's when you get mismatched type exceptions. A lot of times this means you've done some math on an int, it's turned into a double as a result, but you're trying to store it in an int variable. Whenever you see this error, it's a good idea to go back and check your math and make sure that you know exactly what your variable is at each step. Sometimes printing it out in a println will help you visualize what your math is doing and at what point. A lot of times you're going to get the cannot find symbol exception. This means that whatever name you're using for your variable, the computer doesn't understand. The simplest reason is probably because you mistyped it, or maybe you used a different capitalization when you declared it and then from when you called it. The other reason could be because you declared it somewhere after you're trying to use it. Like maybe you forgot that you tried to use it up on line 2, but you didn't declare it until line 10. As far as the computer is concerned, that variable does not exist until after it's declared. Another common issue is forgetting the scope of your variable. Since your variable only lives within the closest set of curly braces, if you make it in one method and then try to use it in another method, the computer's not going to know what's going on. Remember, your variable only lives within a set of curly braces, so wherever you make it, that's where you got to use it. Variables are going to become a cornerstone of all your programming assignments, and it's important to make sure that you're using them, naming them, and moving between the data types well. But don't worry, no matter when you program, you're going to get lots of practice with variables.